Hello, thanks for joining me on the France 24 debate. I'm Cyril Vanier, and today we're going to probe Mitt Romney's foreign policy platform on Syria, Iran, Afghanistan. The Republican presidential hopeful has been sending mixed signals, often accusing President Barack Obama of being too soft. Yet Mitt Romney hasn't outlined a detailed policy of his own. Well, some say he's got no international experience. Has he or doesn't he? Well, that's the question we're going to put to my guest today, Walid Phares. Walid Phares is a regular here on France 24. You're often in our debates, giving us your views and analysis on the Middle East. You're an advisor to the U.S. Congress on Middle East and terrorism. You're also authored a book called The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, in which Walid essentially foresaw what would happen in the Arab Spring. And crucially for this interview, Walid is a special advisor to Mitt Romney on foreign policy. So first of all, this statement that has been made by many observers, many commentators, that Mitt Romney doesn't have a foreign policy. Well, do you think this statement is accurate?
It applies to all or most candidates who have not served directly in government. Senator Barack Obama did not have much in terms of foreign policy. He had many ideas. So what we do usually, if a candidate has not served before, either as a former CIA director such as George Bush I or others, is to look at their positions, statements, but more importantly, books. In his book, Governor Romney, the title is No Apology, has outlined some of the ideas that now he is delivering. But let me say more importantly, he is going to be, after getting the nomination, making speeches in foreign policy. And that would include the Middle East, it would include China, it would include Latin America.
All right, well, let's look at that more closely. What's regarded as a foreign policy priority for the Romney campaign?
Well, first of all, restoring, as he calls it, and the campaign calls it, America's role, which has been undermined in his view. America's role in terms of keeping the peace, in terms of being faithful to allies when they are fighting terrorism, and also, very importantly, America's role in partnering not just with regimes, but also with civil societies. And that applies mostly to the Arab Spring. Governor Romney wrote, and he often mentioned, in the case of Iran, for example, that had he been the president in June of 2009, he would clearly stood with the Iranian uprisers, 2 million of them, most of them women, in the same way now the United States government is standing with the Arab Spring.
Okay, well, let's get down to the specifics then. You mentioned Iran. Mitt Romney, for instance, says that if Barack Obama is reelected, the Iranians will eventually get the nuclear bomb. If he's elected, if Romney's elected, they won't. But he hasn't provided any kind of evidence to support that theory. How do you think Mitt Romney proposes to prevent Iran from getting the nuclear weapon?
Well, 3 points for the evidence. Number one is that had he been the president for the last 4 years, he would have had a different policies, one of which, as I said, is to partner with the opposition forces inside Iran, the Green Revolution, the minorities, all of them rising against the Iranian regime.
But partner with them in what way? Because it's all well and good to say, well, I would have supported this and that side, but at some point you have to say how you would have done it.
It's very easy. Listen to the Iranian opposition groups. That's number one. Civil society in Iran, when they were demonstrating, basically, had signs, including in English and in French and other languages. Why do they have those signs? To tell the international community that they need backing, they need support. We're not talking about Air Force, we're not talking about boots on the ground. We're talking about equipping those civil society forces with what they need for themselves to rise. Radio station, TV stations, NGO training, everything that we've done for others, including Arabs in the Arab Springs before, would be extended in a much, much bigger scale for the Iranian opposition.
Well, if you look at what's going on in Syria, just well-meaning statements are not enough to help the revolutionaries unseat Bashar al-Assad. So that's evidence right there that just professing support for a group doesn't actually help them gain power.
Well, if you ask the Syrian opposition, and France 24 does that all the time, they will tell you, first thing we need is a statement, a strong but clear statement, that we want that regime down, that there is no chance to fix things with this regime, but more importantly, to recognize the Syrian opposition. When you do that, one of the major ripple effects is not the external one. Other members of the armed forces in Syria will start saying, if the international community is recognizing, if France, the United States, and the rest of the international community, that includes also the Arabs, if they would recognize the opposition, it means that there will be an international court that would indict for human rights abuses and crimes. A combination of all this would put more pressure, including on the Syrian armed forces, and they will play a different role than the one they're playing right now.
And so what is your advice to Mitt Romney regarding the Syrian crisis? Because he's there again sent out some mixed signals, saying on the one hand that Barack Obama should be more forceful, and then saying a little later on that he wouldn't be too quick to use force in Syria himself.
There are kilometers, miles between using force and everything that could be done before that. But what you need to do first, and that's what Governor Romney is committed to do, is to state that under no condition this regime will be accepted to be reintegrated. Now, that is something that the Russians are advancing, and that is something that the Obama...
But the Americans have clearly said, and the Obama administration has clearly said, Bashar al-Assad can no longer stay in power. His regime is finished. Is it that kind of statement that you're
that would be
50%?
Yeah, that would be 50% of the road. What the governor would like to do is to take at least a shot at 20 more percent. That would be to call on the International Tribunal to move, to call on the Syrian Armed Command and make them assume responsibility.
So it seems it's mostly talk.
It is the word. The power of the word is very important. But the head of the opposition in a liberal democracy has no means. I mean, Governor Romney is just a candidate for the presidency. He cannot order the armed forces. It's the president. So he's putting pressure on Obama, on President Obama, to take those decisions.
The question is, were he in power, would he act differently? And you're saying that his words would be a little tougher, but his actions would be essentially the same.
Absolutely not. Actually, his actions would be seen much earlier. Let me give you a couple examples. We wouldn't have withdrawn from Iraq, which is the rear flank of Syria, before finishing off the Syrian problem. That's a catastrophic move. Either we would have put more pressure on the Syrian file before December of 2011. We had a whole full year. Unfortunately, the Obama administration waited. It waited too long. It waited for what became later the Annan plan. We wouldn't have waited, number one. Number two, we would have allowed the Turks, the Qataris, the Jordanians, the Saudis, and others to put real pressures, because when our Arab allies sees that there is no commitment to bring down that regime, they're not going to go first. They don't like the United States to drive from behind. And the crucial point, my friend, is that Governor Romney has a position with regard to Iran. He wants to ally himself with the opposition to topple that regime. He said it. He wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. President Obama has still till now a hope that he can fix it with the Iranians. And that's a real difference, not about Syria. It's about the protector of Syria.
And Romney has said he would not engage with the Iranian regime.
Yes, we go back to your previous question. Governor Romney basically said that he will actually have an active policy to equip the Iranian people in all what they need within the limitations to bring down that regime and get a liberal, democratic, or pluralist regime or government in lieu.
You mentioned just a few moments ago that in a Romney administration, he wouldn't have pulled out of Iraq so soon. Let's look at the Afghanistan example. Barack Obama has set a date for the pullout. Mitt Romney agrees with the timetable, but he says that Barack Obama should not have announced the date because that's sort of tipping his cards, his hand, to the Taliban.
Absolutely. When you give a date to the Taliban, and the Taliban are smart people, they have political scientists, they have analysts, they have strategists, and they understand if you give them a date and nothing between now and that date except managing what exists, you are just giving them the counter plan. And the counter plan is to harass American and NATO troops, is to weaken the resolve of the Afghani government, and to wait out the situation and come in. A Romney plan that says, okay, we're going to give a date, but what are you going to do between now and that date? Equipping the Afghani government, creating a force of NGOs, creating the elements of a resistance, the Afghani resistance against the Taliban.
But that's what's happening right now in Afghanistan. The U.S. is working closely with the Afghan government and army, equipping them, training them, giving them weapons, overseeing the way they fight against the Taliban. That's what's happening now.
On the one hand, but what are they doing on the other hand? Trying desperately to negotiate with the Taliban. I mean, signs and signals are everything in a psychological warfare. If you send tanks and trucks to the Karzai government and sit down with the Taliban...
Mitt Romney would refuse to negotiate with the Taliban.
He would be negotiating with the anti-Taliban. I mean, there is a missing bear in the room. There are civil society forces in Afghanistan that have not yet moved up, and nobody...
It's not civil society who's going to win the war in Afghanistan, and surely Mitt Romney knows that.
But he knows that over the past now 12 years, those kids who were 10 years old in 2001, They're 21. They are the new soldiers. They are new teachers. Let's not underestimate what civil society can project. There's 18,000 teachers in Afghanistan who are in contact with the kids from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. That would have cut off the next generation of the Taliban.
Now, moving on to Israel, Romney has said that he wouldn't announce Middle East policy before first asking the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Doesn't he risk being hostage of the Israeli policy if he runs everything by Benjamin Netanyahu?
Look, there is a tradition in the U.S., as we know, that the United States consider any administration, Democrat or Republican, they consider Israel as a privileged, special ally of the United States because of the way it was born and the way it struggled for its own existence. Now,
there's been some tension during the Obama administration.
And there has been a lot of tension, actually, between the Obama administration and the way it was handled with the Israelis. But Obama, as a senator, came to AIPAC and delivered a very strong speech about Jerusalem, and it won't be divided. So such talk, on the one hand, is also sending signals to the other side. What needs to be done in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict is to make sure that those who are supporting the radicals, the problem that we have in the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the actual players, the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's the extremists who, like Hamas, for example, and Hezbollah, armed and supported by Iran, are the ones who are sinking the peace process. We had a peace process in the 90s. In the 90s, we had the Camp David Agreement. What sank the Camp David Agreement were the suicide bombers of the extremists.
All right, Walid Fares, thank you very much for speaking to us right here on France 24. I'm sure we'll be seeing you again on our air very soon. And thank you for watching the France 24 interview. Bye-bye.